There is a certain amount of tension one experiences when fighting off mad villagers and vicious creatures. Those cases when you're desperately trying to reload your weapon, at the same time evading enemies from all sides. That awful dread you get hearing a chainsaw in the distance, knowing full well that some crazy villager wants to carve you up like a holiday ham. And yeah, in keeping with the typical video game conventions, the entire objective is to rescue an underage princess and defeat a massive boss at the end.
It does not get any better or scarier than Resident Evil 4. This is already the lead contender for Best Game in 2005.
I can honestly say that I've never been a real fan of the Resident Evil series, but Resident Evil 4 was always the exception for me. Within 3 months of its release in 2005, the game sold well over 3 million copies for both the GameCube and PlayStation 2, along with winning various awards and accolades. Resident Evil 4 was so good that it forced gamers like me who shunned the series to become instantly hooked. In this video, I will explain how a person like me who shunned the series growing up learned to love the game. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to Smoking Theme Productions, especially if you're obsessed with classic video games from the 6th console generation. On my channel, you'll find plenty of retrospective videos highlighting the classic games we all grew up with. Plus, you can follow my daily live streams of various titles played on either the PC or PlayStation 2. For all my subscribers, new and old, thank you for watching and supporting me this last year or so. Sweet Home was based on the 1989 film of the same name, and while not released outside of Japan, today is held as one of the greatest horror games of all time. And that has to do with the fact that Sweet Home combined the adventure and horror genres together to provide a haunting and thought-provoking atmosphere. But the real legacy of Sweet Home can be found in its mansion setting. The way players felt isolated and disoriented while playing would set the trend in horror-style video games to come. Sweet Home also placed an emphasis on solving various puzzles and backtracking various locations to advance. And with all these things combined, Sweet Home would go on to serve as the blueprint for future horror games and would inspire future game developer Shinji Mikami to create the next big horror series. Much of the original Resident Evil game released in 1996 was based on the 1989 game Sweet Home. In designing the game, the director Shinji Mikami took the key elements from Sweet Home, such as the limited inventory management system and the mansion setting itself, along with a major emphasis on survival. And from there, Capcom would establish the basic formula for the next games that followed afterward. Resident Evil would be released in 1996 for the PlayStation. Everyone was pretty blown away at the time. Not me, as I would have been only 5 years old. I do remember watching my older brother play the game, and it was terrifying. Resident Evil was an intense game. You weren't just playing as a hero or action star, but rather as a relatively weak person trying to survive zombies and other monsters, all while being locked up in a mansion. The original RE was well praised for its cutting-edge graphics and dark violent atmosphere. The game would sell around 2.7 million copies, and from here the RE series was born. Set in Raccoon City, Resident Evil 2 followed the events of Resident Evil 1, this time placing the player directly in the midst of a zombie outbreak, and also allowing the player to experience the game from two perspectives. Rather than being confined to one interior location, Mikami chose to use a real-world location to give players a sense that the world around them was crumbling and decaying. The team would use almost the same setting and environment in the follow-up game Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now, as I said earlier, I was real young when the first game came out.
And besides watching my older brother play the original, I really didn't get to experience this series that well.
The truth is that the early Resident Evil games, while popular and enough to catch my interest, didn't really appeal to me growing up. I was more a fan of the movies, sad to say. Now, this probably had to do with the fact that I was only about 5 years old when the series first came out, and I was just too terrified to play zombie horror games. Looking back now, the major deterrent for me was the gameplay itself. Resident Evil deterred me with its god-awful tank controls and crappy camera.
I mean, these two factors alone were enough for me to shun the video game series altogether. Now, this didn't keep me totally in the dark. Instead of the video games, I focused more on the films growing up. So I still had some vague idea of what happened in the world of Resident Evil. And that goes to show that even if you didn't like the games, you still could appreciate the story and the world that the Capcom writers created throughout the mid to late 90s. By the turn of the century, Resident Evil was the quintessential horror series of the 5th console generation. And naturally, Capcom did everything it could to not only milk the series for all it's worth, but also expand upon the gameplay, characters, and attract new fans. But between 1999 and 2002, the RE series would experience some, let's say, setbacks.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Within this small window of time, Capcom would delve into several attempts to change up the story and gameplay of the Resident Evil series. Capcom's debut Resident Evil game for the 6th console generation was Resident Evil Code Veronica, released in 2000 for the Sega Dreamcast. This game was generally well received and was considered to be a fun and frightening entry to the series, but unfortunately it came out on the Dreamcast, a console that would cease production in the year 2001. While Dreamcast owners got Code Veronica, PlayStation owners got Resident Evil Survivor, an ill attempt at a light gun game that resulted in a mediocre, boring first-person shooter with the light gun feature completely scrapped. The sequel for the game, Survivor 2 Code Veronica, would prove to be a step up, but was considered a disappointment in the long run. Then there was the attempt at the Game Boy game known as Resident Evil Gaiden, which was an interesting port of the original Resident Evil. But this game was more of a turn-based RPG than a survival horror game. I think Capcom redeemed themselves with the release of their first in a long series of remakes, Resident Evil, the remake. Utilizing the advanced graphics capabilities of the GameCube, Capcom provided players with the familiar but visually appealing survivor horror game. In this particular remake, Capcom decided to stick with pre-rendered backgrounds combined with 3D characters. It seemed like an awkward choice, but the end result was something wonderful. Resident Evil the Remake featured a more dynamic camera that could track the player at various angles. Most interesting was the use of particle effects in full motion video. These factors made the environment much more intimidating. This game also included an expanded inventory and new areas to explore. It would be released for the GameCube in 2002 and it was met with critical success. I guess you could argue that this was Capcom's true Resident Evil game for the 6th console generation, along with being the first modern Resident Evil game with the use of full motion cutscenes. Indeed, the Resident Evil remake would set the precedent for future Resident Evil games in terms of visuals. Gameplay though, it was still similar to the older entries and really didn't stand out that much. In truth, one could say that it was simply eye candy for long-term fans of the series. By this point in the early 2000s, many of the development staff that had worked on the original games were handling other major Capcom projects such as Devil May Cry or Onimusha, and the few that remained were getting generally bored with the traditional makeup of Resident Evil games. And this is why you had previous attempts like the Survivor series. In simpler terms, they needed something new to attract new fans. Now, this desire didn't keep them from producing games akin to the previous ones, such as the Resident Evil Outbreak games, but it did get the developers thinking about how they could basically revive Resident Evil and fit it into the modern era. And by 2003, gamers were demanding a bit more action and less suspense. In response to this, Capcom would release Resident Evil Dead Aim, a RE title which blended first and third person camera views with an emphasis on light gun gameplay. And while the game was given a mediocre reception, it seemed like a step in the right direction at the time, as this was the time that the idea for Resident Evil 4 began to be kicked around. Well, actually, work began officially in 1999 under the direction of Hideaki Kamiyami, the writer for Resident Evil 2, and scenario writer Nobuo Sugimura. Resident Evil 4 was originally centered around the protagonist Tony, an invincible action hero with superhuman abilities and weapons, much like the series antagonist Albert Wesker. As much as the developers tried to fit the coolness theme into the world of Resident Evil, the series creator Shinji Mikami thought that the project stemmed far too away from the series' survival horror roots. Rather than scrapping the project altogether, Capcom rolled with it and used the prototype to create the first Devil May Cry game. Development for Resident Evil 4 picked up again in 2001, around the same time Capcom would announce that Resident Evil games would now be exclusive to the GameCube. Yeah, that didn't last too long. Around this time, Capcom had actually released footage of Resident Evil 4 known as the Fog version. Then in 2003 at E3, Capcom showcased the Hookman version of the game that revolved around a similar concept found in Resident Evil 3, which had the Nemesis tyrants stalking you throughout the duration of the game. Scenario writer Yoshia Kamimura drew some inspiration from the film Lost Souls, where the main character runs away from a killer in an abandoned building. In this version of the game, Leon was shown fighting the Hookman, an NPC-like tyrant. It was here where Capcom displayed the various new gameplay aspects such as the over-the-shoulder camera and the laser sight aiming, along with QuickTime events. Capcom had even added some dialogue choices that would later be removed from the final version. In the next phase of the development, known as the hallucination version, the concept was refined to have just Leon infiltrating a huge castle and rescuing a girl that is accompanied by a bioorganic weapon, or BOW. But this idea was scrapped due to disagreements and budget limitations. From here, the team had to do some major revisions. In the long run, not only did they reinvent the series, but made it more friendly and exciting enough to attract new potential fans. Like me, for instance.
The best, most terrifying, and most innovative game of 2005.
Resident Evil 4. We voted it best game of E3 2004.
And after playing it, we have a hard time believing anything released in 2005 will be better than this reimagining of Capcom's survival horror franchise.
GameCube owners, if you were waiting for a miracle, this is it.
A violent, blood-drenched miracle.
Zombies. They shuffle, they moan, they eat brain. They're just straight up annoying. Are you tough enough to tackle the zombie problem in Resident Evil 4?
In Resident Evil 4, you played as one of the protagonists from the second Resident Evil game, Leon Kennedy. Leon is sent on a mission through rural Spain to recover the kidnapped Ashley Graham, the pretty young daughter of the President of the United States. Pretty simple, right? Well, after a heated encounter, Leon finds out that his mission won't be easy at all. As you search the village, more and more slowly, you adjust yourself to the new and improved camera and controls. That's right, gone is the god-awful fixed camera, and in its place is an improved third-person camera view, which places the player right behind the shoulder of Leon. Yeah, to a certain extent, the tank controls are still there, it's just with the new camera angle, they're not as cumbersome. You still control Leon with a single analog or D-pad, and in order to make him run, you hold down a certain button. But the major difference is the reaction time when confronting enemies. With the new camera, you can simply step back or run forward without your vision being impaired. Along with the new camera, you also get a sense of the controls and how they function to control Leon. But more on that later. As your investigation continues, you soon find out that the villagers in this part of rural Spain have been infected by a deadly parasite known as Las Plagas. This parasite is known to attach to its host and force them to act aggressively to anyone or anything that is not affected with the same parasite. Later on, Leon finds out that the parasite was released by the secretive cult known as the Los Illuminados, headed by the antagonist Osmond Saddler. his cult is not only responsible for releasing the parasite, but also kidnapping the president's daughter. It was his intention to infect Ashley with the virus and send her back to the United States, where she could in turn infect US leaders. And from there, Ozma could use the parasite to take over the free world. So much for an easy mission. The new plot of Resident Evil 4 at the time was seen as a major departure from the plots of the previous entries. We barely hear any mention of the Umbrella Corporation other than at the beginning cutscene. For newcomers to the series back in 2005 like me, this made the game more approachable. You didn't need to know about anything story-wise related to the previous games. And ultimately, this made the plot a lot easier to follow. It also forgoes the typical zombie infestation narrative and presents a fresh take on the Resident Evil series. I still must remind myself to this day that there are no zombies in the game whatsoever. Rather, monsters of the Las Plagas completely steal the show. The regular enemies in Resident Evil 4 were much more sophisticated than the zombies you battled on the PS1. They typically attack in groups and can use a variety of weapons to attack you. The villagers of Resident Evil 4 usually stick to using farm tools and other projectiles, while the cult members stick to weapons such as crossbows and morning stars. On occasion, you'll run across several enemies wielding and throwing dynamite. While RE4 did emphasize action-style gameplay with the new ability to point and aim weapons, Capcom was still able to keep all the tension and suspense which characterizes survival horror games. Every time you aim your weapon, your vision to the left, right, and behind you is mostly cut off. This works to provide a great deal of tension and anticipation when battling enemies on the game. And since the enemies attack in groups, oftentimes they will try to ambush you. When getting ambushed, you don't always have time to reload or switch out your weapons. For this reason, Capcom made it so you can easily switch to using a knife in an instant notice. Slashing your knife can prevent Leon from getting gripped up by enemies, along with conserving ammo. I should point out that within your encounters there are several sound cues that you need to pay attention to in order to avoid causing damage. For one, the sounds that the villagers, cultists, and soldiers make, such as the distinctive grunts and animal sounds, are a good indicator of their distance. These sounds can be heard at great ranges. It's notable to mention that Capcom actually used real animal sounds within the designs of the enemies. Additionally, you should listen to the sounds that the enemy weapons make as well, such as the morning stars and the crossbows. And speaking more about the combat, Capcom added a few details to give Leon an edge. Besides the knife slash, Leon can perform kicks to knock enemies back. The kick is helpful for escaping ambushes and providing Leon enough time to reload his weapon. Capcom included several measures to help you invade enemies, such as the ability to climb up ladders and jump out of windows. In various instances, you can shoot gas cans to cause explosions and knock enemies off ledges. Resident Evil 4's combat, combined with the large variety of purchasable weapons, provided players with a certain degree of freedom to confront danger. Now, you could just stand around and shoot at every enemy you see, but by doing this, you're more likely to waste ammo that could have been better used for fighting later bosses or sub-bosses. Rather, you'd be better off finding a doorway to hold up in, and simply use your knife slash to hit enemies as they enter. You might also utilize a ladder to knock enemies down whenever they climb up, and as they are setting up the ladder, simply shoot them. In most cases, it isn't enough to just use guns, as enemies can duck and zigzag around your line of fire. So you have to use your head and always assess the situation, A lot of your brain power will also go into managing your inventory and haggling with the in-game merchant. I'm not sure who this guy is, but he sells weapons, health, and upgrades. You can find him near almost every save location. Along with getting the necessary weapons and upgrades, you can also sell unwanted weapons and any treasure or gold you find throughout the game. This guy is not cheap though. In fact, he price gouges just about everything. But the more you upgrade a weapon, the more money you get back when selling it. Getting back to the story, Leon soon finds himself affected with the Lost Plagas. He does find out about a cure after talking to the researcher Louis Serra, but unfortunately he finds out that the virus eventually takes over the host completely, and can cause mutations within the body as he's seen previous times. We see these mutations occur in enemy encounters and boss fights between the towering figures such as Chief Mendez and the Castellan of the Manor, Salazar. And there we really see the graphic capabilities of the game shown off. This was always my favorite detail that interested me the most about Resident Evil games. And that's the level of gore and blood found throughout your enemy encounters. In this particular game, when mutations occur, well, bodies convulge and spill out openly to the ground, and enemies increase in size in the most disgusting ways imaginable. What really provided a dark setting for RE4 was the processing power of the GameCube. The development team was able to add in plenty of extra details such as fog, flames, and if you play long enough, you'll notice the differences within the environments as the game shifts from day to nighttime. In the daytime, enemies are generally easier, but at night, enemies are harder to see and sometimes they may even act more aggressively. So, what game was awarded GameSpot's Best of 2005? Well, Resident Evil 4. What game won IGN's Best GameCube Game of 2005, along with being a runner-up for the Best Game of 2005? Resident Evil 4. What game was considered by the Spike TV Video Game Awards as Game of the Year? Take a guess. God, does anyone even remember the Spike TV Video Game Awards? The biggest thing related to the release of RE4 I remember is the sheer level of jealousy and envy I expressed for not having a GameCube back then when this game was first released. Luckily, it came out on the PlayStation soon after. So much for Capcom's commitment to the GameCube. But more than likely, the development team saw the vast potential that RE4 had in attracting new players to the series. And it certainly did. The PlayStation 2 version would be released in October 25th of 2005, right before Halloween that year. And if you were lucky enough to own a copy, not only did you get the most popular Resident Evil title to date, but you were also able to play the Separate Ways scenario. It featured in the PlayStation 2 version, which has you playing as Ada Wong. Only 2 years later, the game would then be released for the PC, which included all the PS2 features along with a new easy difficulty. In the same year, the game would also be released for the Nintendo Wii console, like a certain Rockstar game released for the Wii as well, that also made use of the motion control remote and nunchuck to wield weapons. I don't want to get into every single port of RE4, but I think you get it. This game was a huge deal when it came out, and well after the initial release. But Resident Evil 4's legacy isn't so much found in the sales of various ports, but rather in the innovative way Capcom redefined the third-person shooter genre. Let's turn our attention back to the gameplay alterations of Resident Evil 4. The over-the-shoulder viewpoint found in RE4 after 2005 would become a mainstay in a lot of third-person shooters. Some examples you might be familiar with, such as Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas, along with the entire Gears of War series, and also the hit Last of Us. The style of the gameplay provides players with a more immersive experience and made them feel like they were actually the character on the screen. It also works to bring the characters more depth and appreciation. And in the long run, Resident Evil 4 basically set the trend for RE games to focus more on the action aspect in the next canon games such as RE5 and RE6. However, these weren't nearly as good, as many people did detest the games for emphasizing too much action. Despite being considered an action game, Resident Evil 4 was still successful at delivering the survival horror aspect. Much of that had to do with the simple alterations Capcom made to the camera, but it also had to do with the eerie and disorienting environments which were crafted as well. Particularly the gloomy countryside setting which characterizes RE4 would come to influence Resident Evil 7 The Village, along with Resident Evil 8. What more can you say about Resident Evil 4? It's the game that basically saved the Resident Evil series from falling into obscurity by the mid-2000s. It's also a game that greatly influenced the design of future third-person games. And lastly, it's just about the only Resident Evil game to this day that I actually enjoy playing. So what memories do you have of Resident Evil 4? Is this a game you enjoyed growing up or even as an adult? And how does it compare to the traditional entries in the series? Let me know in the comments section. And lastly, thank you for watching this retrospective of Resident Evil 4. If you haven't by now, make sure you subscribe to Smoking Fiend Productions so you can be updated on my future retrospective videos, along with staying in touch with my daily live streams. This is Bob of Smoking Fiend Productions signing off. Peace out, y'all, and stay beautiful.